Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. Today we are getting into a topic that we've really not addressed yet in our discussion of voting behavior to a real extent. And certainly it's something that I know many of you arrived at this course with the expectation that we'd be thinking about it a lot. And that is, of course, this question of persuasion by political campaigns. And so today we'll be talking a little bit about campaign effects. And in this video in particular, I want to sort of back up and think more broadly about theories of information acquisition and essentially how citizens might take the information that they're receiving from campaigns, from other sources, from news media, and then translate that into opinions about issues that, as we've discussed in previous weeks, could still be really important despite the heavy influence of partisan identification and sort of economic and other fundamental valence issues in the campaign. And so if we're to take seriously the idea that campaigns matter, right, as Ellie comes up to me to try to distract me, we need to think about the foundations of a theory, a psychological theory of how those messages might have an effect. And so I want to get into this reading. Obviously, this chapter by John Zoller is one of the most important and sort of most famous works in public opinion research to date. And it's something that, again, I want to sort of just go over the highlights a little bit in this video, just because it is quite dense. And as you're reading it, I want you to be thinking very carefully about the implications of Zoller's particular theory for public opinion. And so the first thing that we should really think about is this idea here in the Zoller chapter, where Zoller is talking about these two different potential types of political messages, that is, persuasive messages and cueing messages. And so essentially this is, I think, a really important delineation, as we'll see later. But Zoller kind of makes this argument that persuasive messages on the one hand are arguments or images providing a reason for taking a position. Right, so his example is a speech by a Democratic politician that says President Bush's budget plan is a sham. Right, so this is obviously a position-taking kind of statement, right? And that we need to delineate from cueing messages. Cueing messages are essentially messages that are simply designed to prompt audiences to just think about or to consider a specific issue or idea, element, or consideration. And so these are kind of two very different types of sort of messages, right? A cue might be quite different than this kind of direct, overt persuasion. And so cues, right, are much more subtle. And they're much more subtle in terms of their ability to change the sort of cognitive process that is going on under the hood when Americans are thinking about these new sources of information. And also, as Zoller is talking about, they're also influential on our emotions, the way that we feel about politics. And so certainly this is a cognitive model, but we can't forget, of course, this idea that we've got emotions at play as well. And so again, just to reiterate, Zoller goes here and actually, harkens back to Converse, which is somebody who we talked about early in the semester with the funnel of causality. Right? It says essentially cueing messages are really this kind of contextual information that kind of wraps itself around the message of the story, right? That convey subtle ideological or partisan implications. Okay, and so these are sort of pieces of information that help individuals determine, unpack, figure out what the world of politics means, right? But it's not as overt as saying, a politician with a clear party identification saying, I think this is stupid, or I think this is great, right? And so again, going back to that President Bush budget plan example, right? They say a Republican voter will be more likely to reject criticism if she recognizes that the person making the criticism is a Democrat. So all we need to know about that piece of information is actually what we might call the source cue, or who it is that's talking. And so we don't need that overt persuasive message. We simply need to know who is talking in order to make a judgment about that information. And so given the fact that our information is coming to us, as we might say, replete with these cues, these kinds of little ornaments, right, around a message that give us insight into sort of what the real political meaning of a statement might be. Whether or not you hear something quoted from Fox News or from MSNBC, that's a cue, right? Whether or not you hear something quoted from a random person on the internet with, 7 followers, or somebody who is, the distinguished professor at, Princeton University or something. You might have different cues about maybe the credibility as well of the information being presented to you. And so again, going back to Zoller's kind of key points here, building from this distinction, this idea that we've got messages and then surrounding those messages cues, right? We can think about several axioms, essentially, that the model, Zoller's sort of information processing model takes. And so the first one is this idea of the reception axiom, okay, reception. And that's really the idea that we need to be sort of tuned in to politics in order to have opinion change happen in the first place. We need to be able to receive that information. Otherwise, there's simply no way that we're going to be able to form any new opinion on the basis of some kind of information. And so essentially this axiom states that if you're cognitively engaged with an issue, that means if you're thinking about the issue, if you're aware of the issue, then that means that you're more likely to actually be exposed to and comprehend, that is, to receive, right? That's why it's the reception axiom, political messages. And so I like to think about people as sort of in this model, the reception axiom, as sort of these like different like basketball hoops, right? Different basketball goals of like different sort of diameters, right? Some people who are extraordinarily not tuned into politics and don't really understand what's going on and don't have very much interest in this stuff, and again has not cognitively engaged with any of these issues in the past. This is going to be like an incredibly sort of tight little hoop that it's going to be virtually impossible for a basketball to pass through the hoop and actually score a point, that is, to actually engage in some sort of opinion change. However, other people who are highly cognitively engaged in an issue and are essentially sort of turned on to politics, their sort of hoops, their goals are going to be really big. And so essentially, like any basketball that's thrown sort of in that direction whatsoever is going to get picked up, is going to fall into the hoop, is going to get picked up by that individual, and might go through the sort of process of potentially creating an opinion change simply because that person is so much more receptive to political information. And so that's kind of the first insight of this model, is that different people are differently sort of tuned in, right? Differently kind of activated in terms of their ability to just receive political information in the first place. So while some people might be bombarded with political information and it sort of just bounces off of them, other people it really sort of impacts them more because they're simply paying more attention. That's the first of these axioms, the reception axiom. And of course, there's a lot of implications to this for the purposes of like political persuasion. The question, obviously, that we care about at the end of the day, which is, do campaigns matter, right? Do these messages actually have an impact on changing people's voting behavior or changing people's opinions that might ultimately form the basis of a voting decision, right? And so beyond that, we have to next think about another axiom here, which is the resistance axiom. And this is this idea that once this idea, once this new piece of information sort of is able to actually pass through that first, ring or that first hoop of reception, and it doesn't just bounce off because the person is so closed down to political information. Once it's able to pass through that hoop, right? I guess now I'm describing a convoluted Rube Goldberg machine or something, right? But now it goes through and something else, another process essentially happens to it where this information can be resisted by individuals. And again, if we think back to somebody like Biscard, right, the reading that we did early in the semester about motivated reasoning, this actually has kind of echoes of that idea in it, even though, again, this resistance axiom was, first debuted in 1992. This was kind of before this motivated reasoning paradigm became current in political science. But the resistance axiom is similar in that it says, essentially, if these arguments, if this information is inconsistent with one's political predispositions, that means that they're going to essentially discard that information. And so Zoller writes here, the key to resistance is information concerning the relationship between arguments and predispositions. And so that idea, I think can be summarized in an example, right? Let's say that somebody's really tuned into politics, right? They're very willing to receive information. And so the reception axiom suggests that information is going to go through their sort of filter, it's going to blast through, and now it's going to get processed cognitively by people. This individual perhaps learns that the economy is doing really, 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 really badly. And yet they are somebody who really, really strongly supports the incumbent, and their political predispositions mean that they are predisposed to think that the economy is actually doing really, 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 really well. And so what happens is, right, they're going to potentially resist the acceptance of that information and say, you know what, I think that story is crap, or I think that whatever that economic indicator is that they're talking about, that probably doesn't actually matter that much. They're going to find some way to resist acceptance of that information, and they're going to find a way to resist having that information actually come in and change their opinion. Right? Their opinion does not change. They will essentially discard the basketball here to go through this extended physical metaphor. They've got this really wide open sort of hoop. It's going to pass through the hoop. It's going to go down into this cognitive processing machine, and this pinball bumper that's just going to like slap it out of the way, and it's not going to, sort of go through the rest of the process. They're going to say, no, I'm going to discount this information in my mind, even sometimes subconsciously, right? And that's kind of the thing about Zoller's kind of ideas, is that this is essentially, a subconscious process, right? People are just saying, I'm going to dismiss this out of hand without really chewing on why they're doing that. Right. So essentially, right, he says, if citizens are well informed, they react mechanically to political ideas on the basis of external cues about their partisan implications. So by mechanically, he essentially means, again, this is a knee-jerk reaction. We tend to resist learning about stuff when that stuff seems to portend bad news for our favorite party. But then he goes on, actually, and says something that I think is very profound about campaigns, and that is the idea that if these individuals are nevertheless too poorly informed to be aware of the cues, they tend to uncritically accept whatever ideas they encounter. So again, this extended, wacky Rube Goldberg physical metaphor here, we've got two kinds of people, is all we're saying. We've got some people where that sort of initial filter, that initial reception axiom is really wide and broad, and a lot of new information is going to end up falling into their sort of hoop really easily, right? However, those people are the ones that are most likely to have these really powerful sort of pinball bumpers. They're going to slap disconfirming information out of the way and reject that information due to the resistance axiom all the time. So that's one type of person, right? A really critical person who really strongly and subconsciously filters their news in a pro-attitudinal way. On the other hand, you've also got this other group of people, their filter's really tight at the top, right? That initial stage, they are very unlikely to learn anything about politics on a daily basis because they're not tuned in. But if some stimulus, if some piece of information manages to squeak its way through that really tight sort of filter at the very top of the process, they don't have any of the bumpers below to be able to critically process that information. It ends up just falling straight through to the next stage and potentially changing opinions. Right, so he says, as normatively unappealing as his implication of the model may be, right? So essentially, he's saying, look, this sounds like kind of bad from the perspective of like good voting behavior. On the one hand, you've got really alert, tuned in people who are bringing in a whole bunch of information and then filtering it out to become essentially partisan biased. And then on the other side, you've got a bunch of extremely non-critical people who are wandering around through the world of politics, very occasionally bumping into a new source of information and then uncritically accepting that as true. And so again, think about our current context. And again, this was written in 1992. I think this probably has something to say about our present context if we were to stop for a moment and think about it. So again, this is just the first two of the axioms as well, right? We also want to think about an additional axiom. You can read this, go through here and read about Petty and Chaikin and a number of other individuals who have done psychological work on this question of source credibility and the processing of resistance. But we want to go further. We want to think about this next one, the accessibility axiom. Okay, the accessibility axiom is an incredibly important sort of third axiom, which essentially says that, again, if we've got these people who are sort of processing information, and some of them are doing it extremely haphazardly, some of them are doing it very carefully, regardless of that process, regardless of that earlier part of the setup, we can imagine that essentially all these different pieces of information have some of them have fallen down through this process into maybe this kind of basket at the bottom, this catching mechanism where all of the new pieces of information that have actually been processed and have actually come to be stored in memory in people's minds, right, are all sort of located there. And so some people who have got a tremendous amount of political knowledge and political information that they've gathered have these baskets that are full of the different pieces of information. Other people might have just a couple of, smattering of little, sort of deflated, shrunken little basketballs down in there. But regardless, the most recent of the things to fall in through that machine, right, are going to be the ones that get retrieved when people are asked to report their political opinions, or critically, and this is the most critical thing for our purposes, when they're asked to recall that information in service of making a decision. Now, what relevant decision could we be thinking about? Well, probably a voting decision. And so this is a really important axiom that rests on some pretty well-established cognitive psychology, which is basically the idea that when we process things in terms of our memory, we tend to reach for relatively recent memories when we're recalling certain stuff, right? So for example, if I were to ask you all, hey, how's the course going? And it was a week after, a really, really hard midterm, you'd say, oh man, this course, it's killing me. It's such a huge amount of work. But if I were to ask you the same question, after week 2 of the semester when we hadn't had any assignments yet, you'd say, yeah, I think it's going pretty well. So it's the most recent thing that's going to be recalled by people when they're making judgments about memory. And so essentially, it makes it easier, it makes it more accessible. So again, if somebody were to say, hey, you've got this basket of ideas that have gone through this Rube Goldberg machine to be filtered in order to form part of your memory, can you recall some memories about a certain idea in order to make a decision? People are going to reach down in that basket, and they're not going to reach down into the bottom. They're going to pull whatever's on top, whatever has most recently fallen into the basket. And so that has a lot of implications for campaigns. And that's kind of the biggest thing that we want to talk about today, right? Is that if we combine that with what's called the response axiom, which is to say that individuals answer survey questions and by proxy make decisions by averaging across these immediately salient or accessible decisions. This means that basically people scoop off that top layer of basketballs and they say, okay, well, let me count up what I got here, and then report essentially what they find from that sort of sample, right, of idea elements or considerations. This means that if campaigns are able to successfully drop new basketballs down through the Rube Goldberg machine into the basket recently, right, or very close to a campaign, they may be able to influence people's ultimate vote choices. Now, again, I don't want to go on too long with this, but I think it's very important. It's a very interesting and valuable model. We need to go back to, again, this resistance axiom, which I think is very core. And that is the idea that if a campaign is the one that's shooting the basketball, right, they're the ones that are actually shooting the basketball, we again need to go back and think about our two sort of stereotypic people. The one person whose Rube Goldberg machine has this really wide net, and so the campaigns are going to basically like be splashing threes like constantly, right? They're throwing in these balls and they're going into the basket all the time, right? Or into the hoop at least. And now they're traveling down through the process. But remember, those people, as we've said, who are extremely attuned to politics, who have that first stage of the process is extremely sort of open and available, they're the ones that have the ability to knock out all of the countervailing information. So again, you're probably like this. You're somebody who's probably seen a bunch of political content in 2020. And maybe on your social media, maybe on television occasionally. If you're watching TV, maybe you're watching a football game or something, and you see a political ad. And of course, you immediately, and perhaps even subconsciously, look at this ad and you think, okay, right, who's this person who's trying to influence my vote decision? Okay, what's their party identification? All right, okay, what do they say about say to the world? Okay, I know all about them and I understand the kinds of messages that they're supposed to be, providing me with, given the fact that they're trying to persuade. And I've got enough cueing information, right? I've got these cues that allow me to make relevant assumptions about the true intentions of this communication. I'm going to bump these out of the way. I'm not going to store this in memory. I'm just going to get rid of it, essentially. I'm not going to process this information. However, the other person, right, the second archetype that we talked about, where maybe this campaign is trying to shoot these basketballs, and they're very, very, very occasionally actually sinking one into this extremely sort of tiny hoop. It's like a game at the county fair where the hoops are, it's virtually impossible to actually get one because the hoops are basically the same size as the ball, right? But when the campaigns do actually manage to get one in there, right, they manage to actually expose an individual to a campaign communication. We know that those individuals who don't have experience with politics essentially, again, don't have the defense mechanisms to engage in resistance. And so they're much more likely to just accept, right, the information as is and say, okay, that makes sense. I will listen to this person because I don't understand anything about cues that might tip me off to the true intentions of this individual. And so with that having been said, right, this altogether forms what's called the RAS model, okay? Opinion statements are the outcome of a process in which people receive new information, decide whether to accept, and of course, by consequence, reject it. So it's really the receive, accept, or reject, and then sample their underlying set of accepted considerations at the moment of answering questions. Or again, we could extend this to the decision-making process. And so essentially, Zahler says, this is what I call the receive, accept, sample, or RAS model. And so again, going back to our broader discussion about the vote process and about campaigns, I think that this tells us something really valuable and important about what campaigns are trying to do, and maybe what campaigns are not trying to do. And so as you sort of leave this video, I want you to really think carefully about this question of campaign communications in a nutshell, right? If you were a campaign that's attempting to persuade, how would you do it? Right? Would you try to persuade individuals by trying to potentially target individuals that have those really sort of shrunken down reception sort of processes, the ones that are paying very little attention to politics? Would you try to throw as many basketballs as possible into these people with the really wide hoops in an effort to try to change, maybe get one or two of these things through those very strong sort of filtering mechanisms in the accept reject phase? Or what, right? How could you do this? And, I think that the ultimate answer to that question, which is something I encourage you to think about, really tells us a lot about the strategies of modern campaigns and about some of the ways in which campaigns attempt to both target voters much more specifically than they did in the past in order to find individuals that are going to be vulnerable, essentially, to potential persuasive appeals. And then also to think very carefully about things that campaigns can do other than opinion change, other than persuasion, that might nevertheless have an important impact on the ultimate vote outcome. So think carefully about this week, and I very much look forward to talking to you about it in just a little while. And good luck with your preparations, and make sure to vote. That's obviously the most important thing that I can say today. So have a wonderful week, and I'll talk to you all next time.